you the whole picture.
Hello, I'm Esther Gidhui-Ewart. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up. Israeli officials say they are pursuing the militant group Hamas across Gaza while trying to minimize harm to civilians. Dubai's COP28 climate summit addresses heavy rains that triggered September's deadly floods in North Africa. And the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres calls on the world to work with persons with disabilities in order to achieve equal rights for all. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. We begin our broadcast in the Middle East, where Israel and Hamas has renewed their fighting. Israeli officials say they are pursuing the militant group across Gaza while trying to minimize harm to civilians. Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari says Hamas chose war by breaching the mediated truce between the two sides.
We have entered a new phase in our war against Hamas. Hamas broke the humanitarian pause when it violated the hostage release agreement by refusing to release women, children, and babies as agreed. Hamas also fired rockets at Israeli homes. It should be clear to everyone by now, Hamas chooses war. Hamas chose war when it broke the hostage release agreement on December 1st. We pursued them in northern Gaza. We're now pursuing Hamas in southern Gaza too. We will operate in maximum force against Hamas terrorists and infrastructures while minimizing harm to the civilian that Hamas places around them as shields. We're pursuing Hamas wherever Hamas is hiding, in the north and in the south. Every rocket launcher, weapons depot, command and control center, senior commander, underground infrastructure, and any hideout where our hostages may be held. Our war is against Hamas, not against the people of Gaza.
Meanwhile, Yemeni's Houthi movement, allies of Hamas in Gaza, says its navy has attacked two Israeli ships, the Unity Explorer and Number 9, with an armed drone and a naval missile. A spokesperson for the group's military says the two ships were targeted in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait between Yemen and Eritrea after they rejected warnings without elaborating. The spokesman says the attacks were in response to the demands of the Yemeni people and will continue until Israeli attacks on our brothers in Gaza end.
The naval forces of the Yemeni armed forces, with the help of Allah Almighty, carried out this morning a targeting operation against two Israeli ships in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The targeted ships were the Unity Explorer and ship Number 9. The first ship was targeted with a naval missile, and the second ship was targeted with a naval drone. The targeting operation came after two ships ignored warning messages from the Yemeni naval forces. The Yemeni armed forces continue to prevent Israeli ships from navigating in the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea until the Israeli aggression against our steadfast brethren in the Gaza Strip ceases. The Yemeni armed forces renew their warning to all Israeli ships or those affiliated with Israelis that they will become legitimate targets if they violate the content of this statement and previous statements issued by the Yemeni armed forces.
An Israeli-linked cargo ship was seized last month by the Houthis, allies of Iran. The group, which controls most of Yemen's Red Sea coast, had previously fired ballistic missiles and armed drones at Israel and vows to target more Israeli vessels. Israel and Hamas are not yet willing to return to the negotiating table to discuss a ceasefire, but Israel says it is trying to minimize civilian casualties as it continues its military offensive in Gaza. VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias reports.
After Israel renewed bombardments in Gaza against Hamas targets, several Palestinian families gathered Sunday at Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in Deir el-Balah to mourn the latest victims of the military offensive, as many prayed for the dead and others continued to flee. The United States affirmed that Israel is heeding its calls to minimize civilian casualties.
They published online a map of places where people could go to avoid combat. There's not a whole lot of modern militaries that would do that. I mean, to telegraph their punches in that way. So they are making an effort.
But Israel and Hamas are still reluctant to negotiate a new truce and the release of more hostages.
Fell apart because Hamas was unwilling and refused to come up with additional lists of women and children, which we know they are holding, and put them on the list so that Israel could evaluate that and we could get them exchanged.
A recently published report by the New York Times points to Israel knowing in advance and playing down Hamas's plan to carry out the October 7th terrorist incursion. The questions that the article raises, however, will need to be answered at a later time. Ron Dermer, Israel's Minister of Strategic Affairs, told ABC.
After the war, we're going to have a serious investigation. It's very important during a war to unite all the forces to achieve a common goal, which we all have, which is to dismantle Hamas's military capabilities, to end its political rule in Gaza, and to ensure that Gaza doesn't represent a threat to Israel, and also to return the hostages.
In Dermer's view, destroying Hamas will open the door to regional peace.
And in the context of that regional peace, we'll have to figure out how we can put ourselves on a path towards an ultimate political settlement with the Palestinians.
Meanwhile, he added, Israel agrees with the United States on the need to reduce civilian casualties in Gaza and to ramp up humanitarian assistance. Veronica Valderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
For more on the Israel-Hamas war, I'm joined live from Tel Aviv, Israel, by Ricky Rosen. Ricky, what's the latest on the bombing in southern Gaza?
Well, they say that there are 200 Israeli tanks that are outside the southern city of Khan Yunis, waiting to go into this very densely populated city in regular times, and now extremely dense because of all the Palestinians who fled from the north when that was the center of Israeli airstrikes. The Israel army has, as your report said, published a map of areas that it plans to attack rather than the wholesale large-scale bombing that they did in the north. But there doesn't seem to be very much room for Palestinians who are in Khan Yunis area and the Rafah area for places for them to flee to, even given their knowledge before of where the airstrikes would be.
That said, Ricky, were civilians warned ahead of time to leave the areas that the Israelis were going to bomb as they did previously, or did they just, get them by surprise? And where are the civilians really taking refuge in Gaza?
The Israeli Air Force dropped leaflets into Khan Yunis, letting people know beforehand. I mean, they've already let them know, and they haven't started the massive airstrikes and tank attack, letting them know which specific areas they were going to be attacking, and telling them to flee to agricultural areas that are not populated, that are close to the Mediterranean Sea. But it's hard to imagine how over 1 million people who are crowded into southern Gaza are all going to move en masse to these relatively empty agricultural areas.
Are there any more prospects of having Israel hostage release with swapping with the Palestinian prisoners at this point?
It does not look very optimistic. The Israeli government called back their representatives for the negotiations who were in Qatar, called them back to Israel because they said that nothing substantive was being discussed, and Hamas announced that there would be no further hostage releases until the end of the war completely, not a temporary ceasefire. And meanwhile, the hostage families are getting more and more desperate and demanding that the Israeli government meet with them to tell them what, if any, moves are being considered to continue the hostage release negotiations. They say that they will carry out a sit-down strike in front of the Defense Ministry until they are allowed to speak to the government.
Ricky, many thanks for your reporting. Ricky Rosen live for us from Tel Aviv, Israel. Now to Africa, where at least 50 people have been killed by floods after heavy rains in the Manyara region of northern Tanzania, according to a senior government official. Severe flooding caused by the El Nino weather phenomenon has killed hundreds of people in Kenya and Somalia in recent weeks. The rains have also left a trail of destruction, ruining infrastructure like roads and submerging towns in East Africa, displacing hundreds of thousands of people. Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan has directed the Ministry of Health and other relevant bodies to focus on ongoing search and rescue efforts to prevent more deaths. In Mozambique, 1 in 4 women between 35 and 39 are living with HIV virus, according to a 2021 National HIV Assessment Report. To combat the stigma associated with HIV and AIDS, a group called Kindlimuka Association is working to help those living with the virus. Amaryllis Gule has this story from Maputo, Mozambique, narrated by Myra de la Salette.
Loss is part of Albertina Tamela's life to this day. In 1996, her husband died of complications from the AIDS virus. Soon after she found out, Tamela and her daughter both tested positive for HIV.
They told us we were HIV positive, and it wasn't easy to hear that, not for me, but because my child was only 1 year and 10 months. I started thinking, such a small kid having to go through treatment for life, it's hard.
Although Tamela tested positive in 1996, she didn't start treatment until 2004. By then, she had another child, a son, who is also HIV positive. Both are undergoing an antiretroviral treatment, or ART, that helps reduce the virus presence in the body down to undetectable levels that can't be passed to others.
We're doing the treatment as it should be, and thank God both he and I have an undetectable viral load. We do it every day.
HIV prevalence in Mozambique remains one of the highest in the world. About 1 in 8 adults is living with HIV, according to the National Survey on the Impact of HIV and AIDS in Mozambique, or INCIDA 2021. Women account for 15% of cases. At the Kindlimuka Association, people living with HIV get the support they need to keep going, says Irene Cossa, executive coordinator at the association.
We work with people living with HIV and AIDS, orphaned and vulnerable children. We look more closely at what they need so that together we can try to bring about a response for them.
The association says personal stories of people living with the virus, like the members who shared their accounts, are found across the country. INCIDA's 2021 report points out that 1 in 4 women between the ages of 35 and 39 is infected. But of those women who know their HIV status, 97.5% are on antiretroviral treatment. For Amaryllis Gule in Maputo, Mozambique, Myra de la Salette, VOA News.
In early November, Nigeria launched its first interconnected solar hybrid mini-grid in Nasarawa State to make electricity more reliable, renewable and accessible. Gibson Emeka reports from Abuja, and Grace Oyenubi narrates.
Community health worker John Maro says he used to rely on a flashlight when working nights at the Sabongida Primary Health Center in Nigeria's Nasarawa State. but that was before a solar grid arrived in his community.
And if there's any case that come in the night, we suffer it, we use this torchlight in order to treat our cases. And for labor cases, it was. We use torchlight. It's not easy.
In Sabongida, a farming community an hour from the state capital of Lafia, community leader Dauda Yakubu says the new solar power grid is making his life easier.
There
has been progress and development in the field of welding, pumping fuel at the filling station, and the likes, as well as grinding, water purification, and refrigeration.
Entrepreneur Suleiman Dauda says the community is enjoying the added ease and other benefits of the solar grid.
Before solar was brought to us, we didn't have light. We only generated light from the generator. But even at that, the generator gave us a lot of challenges.
The first interconnected solar power grid was installed in collaboration with PowerGen, a renewable energy company in Africa that aims to close electricity gaps in rural areas. Omobolanle Atobatele, the head of stakeholder engagement at Husk Power Systems, says in many cases the solar companies can work with more traditional energy companies to keep the lights on.
The regulation also allows us to go into areas where the distribution companies have their franchise area, but they are presently underserving them with electricity with less than 8 hours. And so we can partner with them to provide mini grids to buffer up the supply they're presently giving, so that at least you can have minimum 20 to 23 hours.
It's a great start, but a big job lies ahead. According to the World Bank, about 45% of Nigeria's population lack access to the electricity grid. For Gibson Emeka in Abuja, Nigeria, Grace Oyenubi, VOA News.
Would like to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, the UN Secretary General calls on the world to work with persons with disabilities. We'll be right back.
In times of change, when the world seems uncertain and what we hear doesn't reflect what we see, we seek the truth. When we are told only part of the story, we lose trust. In moments of crisis, our dreams, hopes, and wishes for a better tomorrow depends on a free press. At Voice of America, we bring you the stories that people take risks to see. We connect the world and unite it with truth. At Voice of America, we show you the whole picture.
In other news, Nigeria's Foreign Minister Yusuf Tuga is calling on Niger's ruling military junta to release ousted President Mohamed Bazoum. In a published interview by VOA affiliate Channels TV, Tuga says President Bola Tinubu's administration is asking Niger's military leaders to release President Bazoum so that he will be allowed to leave Niger, go to a third country that is mutually agreed upon. There has been a big shakeup in Guinea-Bissau. On Monday, President Umaro Sissoco Embalo has dissolved the nation's parliament after an attempt to overthrow the government, according to government spokesperson. Clashes between two army factions erupted Thursday night after National Guard soldiers freed an opposition minister who had been detained in a corruption investigation. And authorities say rescuers in Zambia have been unable to locate dozens of illegal miners believed trapped for more than 2 days in a mudslide in the country's main Copperbelt region. The government says at least 30 people were trapped when heavy rains triggered a torrent of mud that buried the open-cast mine in the Chingola region around 400 kilometers north of Lusaka. The heavy rains that triggered September's deadly floods in Libya are only one side of how climate change is impacting North Africa. The other is drought, issues that are on the table at COP28 in Dubai. Lisa Brand has more from Tunis.
Just outside Tunisia's capital, farmer Karim Daoud is radically changing an old family business. He's moving away from milk cows to sheep and goats because they consume less water. He uses drip irrigation and plans for an increasingly dry future.
We're forced to search for water, dig wells at even steeper costs. Agriculture today is experiencing very difficult conditions.
Climate change is shaping Daoud's farming choices. That's not always the case with other growers. Agriculture accounts for more than 3/4 of Tunisia's overall water consumption, even as water supplies are dwindling. The country has weathered 5 years of drought, forcing the government to introduce water rationing and driving up prices for Tunisians struggling with an economic crisis.
People can't afford to buy the fruit because it is too expensive, because of the drought.
The problem is very complex. It's linked to the drought, but also a failure in today's policies of managing this crisis, which is multidimensional.
Poorly maintained infrastructure accounts for heavy water loss. Development, pollution, food waste, and deforestation are also draining supplies. Tunisia isn't the only North African country facing a drier future. Experts say the region faces high water stress that will only get worse.
When we started to work on climate change, we said there would be climate refugees. They'll move to towns for work or flee Tunisia, Morocco, or Algeria for other countries.
Some are turning to old ways of conserving water, like here in Tunis's Medina or Old City.
Traditionally, the homes in the Medina, they had 2 water sources. One is a well, and the second one is they collected rainwater. With the climate change, with drought, with all the water shortage that we're having, they could be very important alternative.
Tunisia's government is drafting a water plan and building desalination plants. But experts say there are no simple solutions to a complicated problem. Farmers like Daoud hope next year will bring rain, but they know it's not enough to save their future. Lisa Bryant for VOA News, Tunis.
The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says there are nearly 1.3 billion persons with disabilities worldwide. He is calling on the world to work with persons with disabilities to design and deliver solutions based on equal rights in every country. For more insight, VOA's Paul Ndiho spoke to Rachel Inebedion, a founder of the Initiative for National Growth Africa and the executive producer of a new documentary, Breaking Boundaries, Empowering Abilities into the Nigerian and Malawi Workforce.
I'm actually not a person with disability, but I understand that disability issues are very important so that we could help support their dignity, help support their rights, and help support their well-being. And as a founder of a non-profit organization in Nigeria known as a Special Needs Initiative for Growth, one thing that I have seen over the years is how people with disabilities have been deprived or limited or restricted from their basic rights and gaining access to political, social, economic, and even cultural life. And that is one of the reasons why we are celebrating the International Day of Persons with Disabilities today. And that is one of the reasons why last year I and my team decided to sit down and collaborate with another organization in the US, whereby we did a project funded by the Department of State and the Mandela Washington Fellowship to produce our first film known as Inclusion Works.
I've had the privilege of watching that film, very powerful. You talked to a lot of people across the continent. At the onset, you talked about how you are not a person with disabilities, but what got you into this? Why put a special focus on trying to highlight this major problem across the continent?
It started from when I was really young, and it's really a personal story to me, but I'm happy to share this with the world because it should be able to inspire someone out there to take up an action and use this action to make a social change. For people who are non-disabled, employment is, a big deal. Not to talk of those who are actually disabled, who are actually labeled because of their certain physical or intellectual disability. And that's basically one of the reasons why my team and I decided to produce this film. Before the filming, one of the things we considered is who are this potential market for employment? These are youths with disabilities. These are people who are able-bodied, or the people employers feel that they are able-bodied. So we're like, okay, we need to get youths with disabilities. And we looked across our other partner, Salama Africa in Malawi. So we decided to also feature persons with disabilities in the refugee camp in Malawi. And together, these voices, these protagonists were able to share their lived experiences of the barriers to gaining access to jobs. Because whether you like it or not, we also have in the business, you have a market for customers with disabilities. So if you hire people with disabilities, they can provide you more additional insight on how to help provide a larger market for customers with disabilities. So it's something that we should take seriously. So, for example, in my country, there's a legislature that says, which is called the Discrimination Against Persons with Disabilities Prohibition Act. That legislation entitles every employer of labor in Nigeria to hire at least 5% of persons with disabilities into public organizations. And the same thing goes with the Malawi government as well. But in reality, is that what it is? And that's basically why we decided to have this film, because we want to sensitize employers of labor to see reasons of hiring persons with disabilities.
That was Rachel Inabedion, founder of Initiative for National Growth Africa, speaking to VOA's Paul Ndiho. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.